Thank you, Rashmi, so much. Thank you, Dr. Kumar. It's a privilege. It's really an honor to speak in front of such audience. I'm deeply thankful to you for inviting me to give this talk. And I hope, I mean, I'm always trying to do, too much in too little time, but I will try to respond to some of the expectations, and by all means do ask questions. After I finish this plenary keynote lecture. Yeah, I mean, my first challenge in presenting this was, what can a Bosnian tell, Indians? Like, what kind of dialogue can we enter, especially since most of us, I mean, not all of us, I've been trained mostly in the Global East or in Eastern Europe, but also I did receive some training from the West. And of course, we studied Gayatri Spivak. Of course, we studied Dipesh Chakrabarti. Of course, all these authors made a huge impact on anyone who ever wanted to be, let's say, a post-colonial scholar or was interested in these things. But the reality is, and this is something that I discuss in my book, Peripheral Selves, and thank you, Mithilesh, for bringing that up, is that being in the periphery is, again, something else. Like, yeah, I mean, it's easy with diasporic scholars. When I was a diasporic scholar in the US or in Germany, it was a very different position. I'm now in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This politics of location, to quote from Adrian Rich, gives me something, a very unique perspective. It is different to be in the West, to be this migrant scholar. And of course, there are also some major scholars from the Balkans who sort of made it to the West, are now studying socialism and whatnot. But I think the geographic locale really, plays a role. And what I wanted to, when I was preparing this talk, I was in an imaginary dialogue with a famous Ugandan scholar, Mahmoud Mamadani, who in his book, Neither Settler Nor Native, since this is kind of also a position that resonates when you're coming from the former Yugoslavia, which was never really an empire. And now we are talking about, decolonial options, even for people coming from Yugoslavia. This is a whole other topic. When Mahmoud Mamadani talks about nationalist violence of modernity, I would like to kind of twist that a bit and talk about the modern violence of nationalism. And this is something that is happening in India, it's happening in Bosnia. And when he talks about the promise of decolonization, I would like to draw attention of my today's audience to a very strong and adamant global politics of anti-colonialism, because I think we just got rid of anti-colonialism too fast, and perhaps, in these struggles between post and decolonial, maybe anti-colonialism is the way to go. What I also wanted to stress, and you, Rashmi, pointed that out at the beginning, was the insistence on this comparative. I do believe there is a potential and productivity in exploring research on doing research on peripheries from peripheries. So not having research on peripheries being produced in the center, but rather being produced where it's happening. And also the issue of commensurability, because I'm very aware of the historical and many other differences between the Balkans and India, and yet I strongly hope that we can enter some productive dialogue and do research together. So without further ado, I'm going to start with my today's keynote, which is entitled On Peripheral Selves, National Populist Predicaments and Post-Colonial Straitjackets. In 1994, William Schneider wrote about new populist political culture and its three recognizable traits: pragmatism, anti-ideology; populism, anti-elites; and personalism, anti-party. For him, the two key figures at the time were Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin. Since we have had many other populist leaders, both in the center and in the periphery, and almost 30 years later, we are yet again asking the question of what new populism is, or rather what it does, as well as what is new about new populism. The rise of populist regimes has triggered many responses about populism, both on the left and on the right, as well as comparisons between populism and nationalism. At its most fundamental level, new populism is against elites and plurality, but it is a thin-centered ideology that divides society into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups by producing epistemes of nationhood for the purposes of preserving power via ideology. What, if anything, has changed in terms of ideology, and what about the affects? Whereas populism can also go towards the left, embracing the low-income citizenry as the nation's true people, just as nationalism can include ethnic and racial diversity under its umbrella, my focus here will be on the connection between populism and right-wing politics, as they're both in the idea of popular sovereignty. This is the modern violence of nationalism. They look alike when populism gravitates towards the right, identifying the people with an ethnic or racial majority, and when nationalism turns against the minorities, leaving populist politics to thrive on a virtually relentless mobilization of popular energy. Nationalism acquires this fervent form mainly under two conditions: when it's secessionary, trying to break states up, like it happened in former Yugoslavia, or when it becomes majoritarian, attacking internal minorities. It does not happen without politics of affect, which in addition to ideology is the basis of the mustered collective energy. Effective mobilization is usually premised on a central line of sedimentary ties and attunements, the ways in which history and the past are recollected and sensed via theory of the body, whereby the effective body is an event. Post-Dayton space-time in Bosnia and Herzegovina, just as the post-independence space-time in India, have been recolonized, and approaching it via affect is a way to symbolically decolonize it by learning what these assemblages were like and what kind of effective capacities, to quote Deleuze and Guattari, they generate. Affects produce further effective capacities within assemblages, and because one affect can produce more than one capacity, social production is, they say, not linear, but rhizomic, a branching, reversing, coalescing, and rupturing flow. Nationalism can easily exist in a quieter register, but it has not been so in the context of India, just as it has not been in Bosnia. In fact, in both countries, it has been secessionary and majoritarian, and mobilizing racism with or without race, to quote Balibar. The two nationalisms have been rather grounded, antagonizing the minorities and producing epistemes on what counts or what constitutes pure people, and right-wing populists will define pure people relying on religion, nation, race, ethnicity. There are always some pure people and corrupt elites, whether they're Muslims and Christians, pure Muslims and impure Muslims, Hindus and non-Hindus, blacks and whites, or in Bosnia, Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks, who all look alike, but still have insurmountable politically produced ethno-cultural differences that divide them. We all know there is no movement without populism, but we should be wary of the populism used to antagonize, persecute, torture, and expel. For many of my fellow countrymen and women, the World War II, as well as the 92-95 war, have been two key events in modern history and reservoirs of meaning from which current political elites derive their legitimacy and preach ethnic nationalism via populist argument of us versus them. Of course, there are the two genocides, the one against the Serbs in 1941 and the one against Muslims in Srebrenica in 1995. Both of these events, however contested, have in the bodily sense been the basis of affects used not to create commonalities and heal the communities, but rather to divide the people and generate the so-called ancient hatreds. For peripheral selves living in post-war Bosnia meant living in an assemblage comprising of the intensity of the most recent 92-95 war, of which I was a witness to, with an estimated death toll of 95,940, out of whom more than 38,239 Bosnian civilians, 31,107 of whom Bosniaks, 4,000 Bosniaks, 4,178 of whom Serbs, 2,484 Croats, and 470 others, according to Tokacha. It also meant living in the eco World War II with a total death toll of 600,000. It's an estimated number between 600,000 and 1.1 million, out of whom again between 300 and 600,000 of mostly Serbs in World War II. The materiality of living amidst genocides as the order word, to again quote from Deleuze and Guattari, meant living in an intensity of bodies easily incited and mobilizable for preemptive military action whenever the state was trying to make a point. The massive victory of Narendra Modi-led Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, India's extreme right-wing party, in the 2014 and 2019 parliamentary elections has led many political commentators to argue that India's liberal and secular democracy is now firmly in the grip of Hindutva populism. Hindutva, or Hindu nationalism, is the political belief that India is for and of the majority Hindu community. Similarly, the 92-95 war in Bosnia, during which socialist Yugoslavia was dismantled, and during which more than around 100,000 people died, a lot of whom, as I said earlier, innocent civilians, has created nation states from the former Yugoslav republics, and in Bosnia, a deeply divided society run by a tripartite rotating presidency consisting of a Serb, a Croat, and a Bosniak Muslim representative, the three-headed monster, as well as their three nationalisms. Whereas anyone who regards India as both her fatherland and holy land is a Hindu, and this includes Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, and Buddhists, who satisfy the twin criteria, Christians, Jews, Parsis, and most prominently Muslims, do not meet these twin principles because members of these religious groups do not regard India as their true holy land. Whereas the post-independence Indian 1950 constitution rejected ethnocultural nationalism, recognizing India as a country where people belonging to different religions and ethnicities could live together as equal rights-bearing citizens, the same was true for the socialist Yugoslavia. The 1990s wars legitimized ethnic nationalism in the former Yugoslav republics, including Bosnia and Herzegovina. Similarly, in India, it too gained prominence with the rise of the BJP's ethnocultural nationalism becoming the dominant narrative after 2014. As I am sure that there are many more, two projective trajectories which Bosnia and India share are those between Indian ethnocultural nationalism and Bosnian ethno-nationalism, including the rise of the right-wing nationalisms in both contexts, and secondly, an overlap of post-coloniality as peripherality, which is also in the ex-Yugoslav case preceded by a period of socialism. To analyze and enter dialogue between different peripheries and what constitutes this new populism, if we can even call it so, means to adopt a longue durée perspective, a post-colonial but also historical materialist lens, and to take the colonial option as a possible way out of the conundrum. Despite the seeming incommensurability of the Indian and Bosnian experience, we are both peripheral selves, bodies emerging out of peripheral spaces filled with colonial violence, wartime destruction, and uncertainty. We are conditioned by multiple oppressions, including wars and policing, privatizations, denial of justice, as well as various gatekeeping processes from within and without, inhibiting the circulation of knowledge in people. These oppressions include historical as well as more contemporary practices, from racial profiling to pushbacks at the EU border, everyday racism towards migrants, to ethnic discrimination and clientelism in the distribution of jobs and justice, fueling more migration and poverty. To say something about peripheral selves populist predicaments and post-colonial straitjackets would be to uncover the histories and agents shaping us and ruling us, and only by knowing them well can we rid of straitjackets that imprison us. Ethnic nationalism or ethno-nationalism is a loyalty to the nation deprived of its own state and a loyalty to an ethnic group embodied in a specific state, especially when the latter is considered a nation state. This is a quote from Connor. Ethno-nationality is related to predecessors, heritage, and preservation of continuity. As such, it is an organizing and legitimizing principle characterized by the practices of delegitimation and re-legitimation reflected in a concrete discourse that is creation of us and them. Nationalism instrumentalizes people's fears by providing simple explanations and solutions to social problems. Furthermore, it rests on irrational fears of others. And when in constant fear, people become extremely susceptible to authority. To quote Gellner, by supporting the attitudes of the majority, an individual also undergoes conformist adjustment. He or she joins the silent minority and thus increases the probability of continuing to achieve their private interest undisputedly. Whereas on the one hand, nationalism exists as a discourse which cognitively classifies world population by groups, nations. On the other hand, it also exists as a normative political project of the exclusion of the other, thus gaining its legitimacy. Studying nationalism and ethnocentrism with the emphasis on the post-communist societies of Europe, Rogers Brubaker focused on frame, structure, and style of nationalism, identifying two opposing perspectives: the return of the oppressed and the manipulation of the elites. While he believed that the return of the oppressed, the escalation of nationalism in post-communist Europe, could be accounted for by the state of numbness or reckless oppression of the national in anti-national communist regimes, which rested again on the discourse of ancient hatred, reawakened in post-socialism, the manipulation by the elites, according to Rogers Brubaker, presupposed the existence of the oligarchies, which consciously spurred nationalist passions in order to preserve their own positions. Brubaker considered the latter view to be partially true, but he criticized its universal character and the ease with which national passions can always, everywhere, and by whomever be spurred in a politically profitable manner. For Bosnian and Herzegovinian post-war politicians, ethnic nationalism was indeed very profitable. During the war, what had been defined as socially owned in the former Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia during self-management and so on, was now declared by various laws, after the war, now, as state-owned property or private capital, a practice of dispossession through which the political elites and warlords robbed Bosnian citizens of what had previously been understood as common ownership. Legal validation of this dispossession came through the USAID guided privatization in 1997, as the privatizations of what were now state-owned enterprises. The General Framework Agreement for Peace, or the popular Dayton Peace Agreement, was signed in Dayton, Ohio on the 21st of November, 1995. The agreement did put an end to the 92-95 war in Bosnia and formally divided the country into two entities, the Republika Srpska and the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as the autonomous Brčko district. Annex 4 of the agreement became the BNH Bosnian Constitution, a constitutional package that established Serbs, Croats, and Muslims, or Bosniaks, as constitutive peoples. It simultaneously relegated all those who did not or could not identify as belonging to one of these groups to second-class status, barring them from fully participating in the country's political life, proclaiming the victory of the 92-95 politics. So unless you're a Serb, Croat, or Bosniak Muslim, if you're Jewish, if you're whatever, you cannot participate in Bosnia's political life. To quote Emir Haydarpašić in his 2015 paper, if someone had said in 1995 that the politicians of this small, war-torn, and impoverished country, heavily scrutinized by the international community, would go on to make themselves the proportionately highest paid representatives in Europe, to expropriate the country's key economic resources with impunity, to take out staggering loans for unrealized projects, and to block any attempts at changing this situation, all in less than 20 years after the General Framework Agreement for Peace, most experts would have dismissed such statements as unrealistic and impossible. Yet this is precisely what happened with the formation of new political forces after Dayton. Throughout the Dayton period, Bosnia has been in a state of perpetual transition on a presumed pathway to join the EU, but subject to an ever-changing message about how and under what terms. This is in part the result of the Dayton Agreement itself, which did bring peace to the country, but produced a disorder that needed to be managed both by the local and international elites among different levels and jurisdictions of government due to its complex power-sharing mechanisms. The new ethnopolitical entrepreneurs benefited financially and in every other way from ethnic nationalism and ethnic cleansing. Others, those who lost everything during the war, or those who could not accommodate these new identities in their exclusivity, becoming also losers in transition, were not so lucky. Yet the transition itself has not been so smooth. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, as a lived experience, a state of mind, and a figure of thought, has remained an open wound that kept reappearing as a haunting apparition. The 92-95 war seemed to have represented the symbolic death of the Yugoslav socialist legacy with the international community's blessing. This rings especially true in light of the recent ruling of the Dutch Supreme Court about the Dutch troops' liability for the Srebrenica massacre. Moving away from the horizons of socially owned property and self-management to imperfect but real features of Yugoslav socialism, the 92-95 war in Bosnia and the transition of the country to a free market economy and liberal democracy, orchestrated by the international community and implemented by the local ethno-nationalist elites, have in fact produced not one, but several peripheries in the former Yugoslav country. The destruction of the 92-95 war and post-war deindustrialization brought about political as well as economic reorganization, with ethnic differences between the three main ethnic groups and economic motives often played overlapping roles in it. In post-socialism, therefore, socially owned property was passed into the hands of private individuals or political parties, making the new ethno-nationalist elites the legal successors of the country they helped abolish. The old socialist working class has practically disappeared, as today's workers are not only the few employed in the industry, but also represent a huge number of unemployed, unpaid, and precarious workers in the service sector. Neoliberal capitalism, with its intrinsically violent processes of capital creation and capitalist mode of production, by and large dissolved socialist Yugoslavia, assisted by ethnic nationalism. Ethnic cleansing and genocidal practices were utilized along with, for instance, acts of different parliaments following privatizations to create legal grounds for expropriation and dispossession. It was further refined by the international community that strategically promoted capitalist violence under the label of transition to democracy. This is a classic Luxembourgian Landnahme moment, one that cries for help to decolonization. In the outer markets, the principle of equivalent exchange, that is, exchanging values of similar magnitude, applies to a limited degree at best. Arbitrariness and open violence are predominant here. Such violence aims to at least temporarily maintain social groups, territories, or even entire countries at pre-capitalist or less developed stage, or we may add at a stage of peripherality. Ethno-nationalist and capitalist hegemony eventually won out, and the mainstream political vision, which included post-war historical revisionism of the socialist period, became a tool of the new hegemonic order, paving the way for the processes of privatization and destruction by the elites at the expense of most citizens. As with the rest of the former Yugoslavia, the most visible axis of oppression in Bosnia was not classic racism, but rather ethnic nationalism, coupled with neoliberalism that was used as a category of oppression towards other different social groups, accumulate capital, and produce a small yet stable salariat of permanently employed and paid workforce associated with the ruling parties. It also produced the projectariat, meaning people who continued working for international NGOs and against whom there's a lot of criticism going on, but mostly the precariat. The post-war period saw terrible infrastructural devastation, loss of major industries, and pauperization of the population coupled with brain drain. Under the pretext of trying to provide ethnic justice among the three divided people, ethno-nationalist post-war rule became complicit in shady privatizations and an irresponsible selling off of natural wealth such as forests, waters, and energy. With the public sector firmly in their grip, they distributed jobs to their political clientele and left many people on the brink of poverty, contributing to the third wave of BNH, Bosnian immigrants leaving the country to become new workforce in the EU, which further peripheralized the country. Bosnia and Herzegovina has been peripheralized and colonized multiple times and from multiple sides, not only from the outside by neighboring Serbia and Croatia, with their expansionist appetites and the external tutelage of the international community. The Office of the High Representative, OHR, was part and parcel of the Dayton Agreement with a forced democratization through the international community's liberal imperialism, acting as the middleman and holding a stick and carrot in response to a near permanent state of emergency and failed Europeanization. From the inside, peripheralization was carried out by comprador political elites thriving on nationalist capitalism, seeking total control over the police, the media, the universities, the businesses and properties and assets gained through privatization of socially owned property. Insisting on interconnectivities which link these places to processes nested at other spatial scales into research design, research on peripheries should not merely limit itself to the description of peripheral places, but should instead integrate with a study of the changing function of these places in larger social spatial configurations, which demands a historical perspective. How are we post-colonial? Historically, Bosnia was a non-conventional hybrid type of colony beset by many contradictions, including different racialization strategies and complex forms of exploitation. In Ottoman times, they included the haraj, a poll tax on non-Muslims, the devshirme system of recruiting Christian youths into janissaries, as well as the jus prima noctis as institutionalized rape of Christian women, a strategy of occupying the land by grabbing the body, female body, employed by the Ottomans as ravishers of Balkan women and invaders of Christian virgins. This is a quote from Nena Mochnik. The female body thus became a disposable place of colonization in the post-Ottoman times, most intensely during the 90s war in Bosnia, when mass rape, in fact, doubled the colonization in a Christian man versus Muslim woman interpretative frame as a discourse seeking historical revenge. During the Austro-Hungarian rule, Bosnia was a proximate colony where, at the heart of the Habsburg administrators' approach to their colonial subject was a pervasive paternalism, economic exploitation to bolster the Austrian and Hungarian industry and their moneylenders, and where the main wealth of the country, the huge Bosnian woods, was yielded at unbelievably low prices to foreign firms. Little has changed since. Reflecting on Serbian, Croatian, and Bosniak historians' view of the colonial role of the Austro-Hungarians, Tine Verweerd relies on a number of local and international resources. He quotes a Croatian historian, Anto Malbaša, who draws on an 1898 article by Edward Richter, a geographer and professor at the University of Graz, saying Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I'm quoting this, is neither Java nor India, but when Bosnia is compared with the colonies that other European states obtained during the last decades, we have to admit that Austria acquired a region that is of much more worth and much more favorably situated than the majority of the other countries. Verweerd thus concludes that Yugoslav historians, even those outside of the nationalist discourse, refer to the economic policy of Austro-Hungary in the occupied and later annexed provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina mainly as colonial and exploitative, and not as a polemic epithet or in a metaphorical sense of the word. According to them, Bosnia literally was a colony of the dual monarchy. The fact that they experienced Austro-Hungarian rule as colonial and presented as such in historical works is a factor of importance in reconstructing the development of the self-image of the Bosnian, South Slav periphery of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. The extensive use of the colonial discourse in Yugoslav historical literature shows that, at least according to the historians cited here, a post-colonial approach to the dual monarchy seems to be justified. Stricto sensu, rather than a colony of Austria-Hungary, Bosnia was more of a protectorate, if only because of its proximity to the imperial center and on the account of South Slavs' whiteness, albeit considered second-rate and not quite European. Still, the Austro-Hungarian rule is in many ways reminiscent of the colonial policy of Western powers elsewhere in the world. To see the history somewhat repeated, it suffices to mention that Bosnia and Herzegovina was from March 2009 until July this year, so 12 years, run by the Austrian diplomat Valentin Itzko as the High Representative. Why is this contextualization of Bosnia's former coloniality relevant, both from the historical and sociological perspectives? Sociologist and dear colleague Manuela Boatka argues that a growing body of world systems authors in history and post-colonial and critical development studies have revealed that the economic, political, and ideological domination that different parts of Eastern and Southeastern Europe experienced at different times, beginning in the 16th century, followed a sequence that went from proto-colonial to the neo-colonial at best, despite the absence of formal colonization. Maria Todorova, as a historian, mentions liberal applications of notions such as colonial and post-colonial to hinge them to a broader universal theory whereby one can use decolonization as a metaphor and as a synonym for the struggle against subjugation and exploitation. Critical education scholars Tuck and Yang warn even more explicitly against the metaphorical use of decolonization. Because, and I quote, when metaphor invades decolonization, it kills the very possibility of it. Despite the discourses and framework preceding it being critical, even if they are anti-racist, even if they're justice frameworks, when we write about decolonization, we are not offering it as a metaphor. It is not an approximation of other experiences of oppression, and it does not have a synonym. Acknowledging the deeply unsettling work of decolonization, I propose that the struggles against colonization in the Balkans should not in any way be positioned as equal to other struggles in more traditional colonial contexts, such as Africa, Asia, or Latin America. Instead, they should be read within this optic because they share traits of peripherality and mobilize a colonial wound, which belongs to the affective register. Moreover, adopting a comparative perspective facilitates better understanding of the workings of the coloniality of power, including privatization and appropriation, racism, genocide, ecocide, and injustice, and political acts of resistance to that power. Such peripheral encounters may open space for future global productive synergies and emancipatory politics beyond the essentialism of multiculturalism, where we can learn from one another and be in struggles together. Locally, it may provide insight into why Bosnia has recently been assigned the role of a double transit country, of either containing unwanted bodies from North Africa, Southeast Asia, most notably Pakistan, and the Middle East, or supplying Europe with those desirable as workforce, the Bosnians, white Bosnians coming in hundreds of thousands to Germany to work, whereby both groups are to a different degree peripheral selves. The paternalism, extractivism, and tensions between different ethnic groups that mark the colonial past of the South Slavs under the dual monarchy, for example, invite parallels with today's impoverished, war-torn, only partly sovereign European peripheries with ethno-nationalist leaderships. Ever since the signing of the Dayton Agreement, Bosnia has been a hotspot for international diplomats, policymakers, and foreign scholars, as a place where interventionism and extractivism have often co-opted and naturalized peace and state building without considering the internal dynamics of its people, just like the internal dynamics of subalterns were not considered in the colonial project. Just recently, the leading High Representative Valentin Inzko issued an order on prohibiting genocide denial in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but he did so during the last week of his 12-year-long rule as head of the OHR. Bosnian and Herzegovinian society has not come to terms with what happened in Srebrenica, despite the International Tribunal for War Crimes in former Yugoslavia in the Hague rulings, and the High Representative had to introduce amendment to the BNA, to the Bosnian Criminal Code, imposing jail terms for genocide denial. It is mostly Serbs who reject that there had been genocide in Srebrenica, despite acquiescing to it being an atrocious crime. Such imposition by Inzko has exactly been a peripheral predicament of a society in which ethno-nationalist entrepreneurs have prevented any form of meaningful and genuinely repentant coming to terms with the past, while tying the society, regardless of the ethnic division, into a post-colonial straitjacket prohibiting bottom-up democratic endeavors. Non-traditional colonizers have been engaged in aggressive recolonization, often concealing the mechanisms of the new forms of colonization. With strong support of the state apparatus, the elites adopted a strategy of cross-dressing and articulated new forms of co-optation and neutralization. And in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it was a tug of war between the new Bosnian elites and the international community over who was more colonial. But both of them were nonetheless instrumental in colonizing post-Dayton Bosnia with narratives of impossible state due to Islamic fundamentalism or through the unrestricted powers of the OHR. To illustrate this absurdity, the consociationism of the Dayton Agreement Constitution was presented as multiculturalism made official in ethnically cleansed territories after more than hundreds of thousands of dead, which now most of its citizens want to leave. Viewing the decolonial option as an active and conscious, ethical, political, and epistemic position whose goal is to decolonize thinking, being, perception, gender, and memory, means being committed epistemically and in the emancipatory sense to a better and more just life. It started as a cry against slavery and racism, but has since become a pathway to global solidarity, that an uneasy, reserved, and unsettling matter that neither reconciles present grievances nor forecloses future conflict, to quote Tuck and Yang. Seeing through the decolonial lenses would entail recognizing and critiquing practices of ethnic cleansing, appropriation, colonization, conducting during and after the war by the international and local elites through warfare, abolition of social ownership, privatization, accumulation of debt, with complete disregard for people and the environment. It would mean rethinking a future of greater emancipation of women and other marginalized groups, of anti-imperialism, anti-fascism, and anti-racism. Only then could we perhaps untie the tangle knot of the new populism that is generating the prevalent right-wing type of secessionary and discriminatory politics that was mentioned at the beginning. To quote Maria Lugones here, if deep coalitions are ever to be established, this needs to change. Recognizing the specificities of political subjects of decolonial struggles does not preclude dismissing other anti-colonial struggles, many of which have socialist roots. Adopting a new vocabulary and grammars should not in any way divorce peripheral selves from future political struggles of which they might otherwise be agents, but should instead bring them together in solidarity and dialogue. Speaking about decolonial potentials and communist political horizons, to quote Jody Dean, in post-socialist, post-Dayton Bosnia, we must bear in mind that the axis of coloniality over-determines the networks of social relations that deal with control over labor, nature, gender, and reproduction, subjectivity and knowledge and authority with all their products and resources. These networks beg for analysis over and across specific geographic spaces, including the less traditionally colonial ones. New populism has been part and parcel of modernity and a powerful tool for effective mobilizations against which revolutionary affects mobilized against the injustice and oppression brought by the new populism need to be generated anew, against whom a serious work on the ground, and not the one necessarily funded by the international NGOs, should be directed. This is a tedious work, the one of radical decolonization from central capitalist control through an active, actual delinking, to quote Samir Amin, as a refusal to subordinate national development strategy to the imperative of globalization. Even if it immediately appears as a process of dispossession, exclusion, pauperization, underdevelopment is not a delay, but a concomitant product of development, and social structures in the periphery are not vestiges of the past, but results of distortion of the earlier societies as shaping the new ones to be useful to imperialist expansionism of global capitalism. For defining the relationships between the core and periphery, various triggering factors and political influences, as well as the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, may also determine the nature and course of this relationship, stirring the affect of future agents of revolt. Inasmuch as World War II was a revolutionary event, which made previously invisible agents of revolt not only visible, but victorious. However, the 1990s counter-revolution mobilized different agents. From them, Yugoslavia was a mistake, a prison of nations, on whose ruins post-Dayton Bosnia was created. The position of the periphery is also not determined once and for all. The peripheral status of countries may be subject to change if they manage to achieve success in enhancing their position and change their relations to the core. But this also applies to the way peripheral selves on the margin of Europe understand their role as the disenfranchised, pauperized other waiting at the EU's door. They have been inhabitants of a symbolic rest stop on the road to the center, just as many Middle Easterners, North Africans, and Southeast Asians en route have following the 2015 migrations as a process most reflective of the crisis of late capitalism. In the recent years, the response of the peripheral selves trying to resist the structural violence of this system has been to either occupy through protests or leave. Whereas obedient and interest-driven connected bodies in the periphery can survive and even thrive because of their uncontested relationship with the elites, the question here is for how much longer peripheries can be transits and waiting rooms, supplying either laboring bodies or containing the racialized and injured bodies currently prohibited from entering the center. Stoller's insistence on re-examining what constitutes contemporary colonial relations, what counts as an imperial pursuit, and which geopolitics rests on residual or reactivated imperial practices urges us to further inquire into the relationship between the post-colonial, the decolonial, and the peripheral. And last paragraph. Any practice of solidarity needs to foster dialogues embracing the deep differences in the way we live, make sense of the world, and envision specific futures. These debates and their historical precepts continue to be relevant for the contemporary left, progressive internationalism, as well as for more comprehensive anti-racist decolonization projects toward a no longer colonial future, making sure that material, to quote Ferreira de Silva, that material and immaterial, presential and virtual expressions of solidarity multiply and last on the smoldering ashes of colonialism. Recognizing the historical as well as political economic dimensions of global oppression, part and parcel of which theft and dispossession as well as clientelism and pauperization in our own backyards, ability to think with comparatively and to tune the political affects differently, not in the parochial sense to protect the little national turf, but in the sense of deep coalitions against the global oppression and towards solidarity, because only then it will work. It means seeing through cheap new populism, realizing that peripheral predicaments are changeable and that the post-colonial straitjacket shadowable. Maybe that's what anti-colonial truly means. Thank you very much.